Okay. Mixing tentacles into your creatures. Um, One thing is we have not talked today about a whole range of other creatures. I want to say things like squid or anemones, or not squid, sorry, sponges or anemones, or worms like annelids. And the reason we haven't is that those creatures, while cool as design ideas for maybe small environmental creatures, those animals tend to be very slow and or only work, or immobile in some cases, and or only work when they're really small. And so I've skipped them because they're not going to usually be useful designs for your sort of hero creatures. Sorry if those of you can hear a giant airplane flying over my house. And so they would be interesting ideas in their own right, but not until you're like maybe designing little side creatures for Avatar. So we will look at octopus, squid, and sea stars. Obviously, tentacles are a great design element. Everyone loves them, unless I guess you're a female character in an anime. Here, by the way, is a pro tip. If you decide to look up tentacle anatomy in Google, be sure to have the safe search turned on. Anyways, that aside past us, yeah, I learned that one the hard way. Sea stars are cool in that they have a whole range of tentacle sizes that work, and they're relatively powerful for their size, and they even work out of water pretty nicely. The problem is that they're very slow to act. The group they belong to, echinoderms, have this awesomely alien and unique system where rather than muscles, they have an entire system of canals and bags in their limbs that are filled with liquid, and they pump liquid into them or out of them, there's two whole sets there, in order to change the shape. So rather than like having muscles like you would think, they have spicules, little bits of actual like organically shaped glass-like stuff as kind of a skeleton that helps hold them together, and then they inflate and deflate little sacs in those spicules to like make the tentacles move. And it is fairly powerful. They can open up bivalves, shelled animals and such quite neatly. But what they cannot do is do it really super fast. So they might make a really great design for some sort of slow-moving, suspense-based horror creature if like your victim could not get away, but they're not going to make good for a chase. Right. No, you're right, Ian. It's exactly, well, I wouldn't say exactly, but it is analogous to that. And it's very neat. The problem is, I thought about this, like how could we make a fast-acting one? And I don't want to say it's impossible, but I'm having a hard time coming up with a plausible fast-acting one, especially on land. And that's because to make it move fast, of course, you have to basically squeeze liquid into these bags at a much higher pressure. And the problem with organic tissue is it doesn't deal well with being under pressure. You tend to pop. And the only way to solve that would be to make it much thicker, but when you make it much thicker, then it gets much harder to squeeze the liquid into it, and you kind of get into a nasty feedback loop where like your attempt to solve it basically makes it harder to solve. So I will note these as a very cool design and one very much worthwhile if you're doing an alternative creature, like the hexapod camouflage cat that's like a bird catcher. If you had an animal that moved slowly amongst the trees, you could get away with this sort of a limb structure if it never had to go fast. But it's probably not going to work for hero creatures as we think of them in movies and TV design and such. Here's just another image of that. It's a crazy system. It's really cool. Totally worthy if you're reading about it. If you're bored and want to go to Wikipedia, or just Google it and see what you can get with safe search on, at least moderately. Yeah, that'd be cool. And actually, these guys, their stomachs are down here. They'll actually like expand their stomachs out to get you, like, and then digest you and pull it back in. Which, let's face it, is sort of cool and horrific if it's happening to like a person or a puppy or something. I don't know. So yeah, there's definitely cool ideas here. It just is a little hard to apply if plausibility is our watchword to big aliens that have to like fight the Marines or something. Whereas squid and octopi, of course, have wonderful tentacles. They do move quite quickly. They do have a few limitations, but they're really ridiculously useful. These are some cross sections taken through them. These are drawings, obviously, of cross sections, but you can see like they have a whole range of like different muscles running down them, which allow them to contract in very different ways, which is why you get that my tentacle can go anywhere and do anything sort of action on them. Of course, they're wonderful because they have these great big suction cups, meaning they can hold on to a variety of surfaces. I don't know if you've seen this, but some squid, this is from the ridiculously huge, gigantic squid, almost the real name, and they have these weapons on their suckers that are like teeth. And some of them on their two long draping tentacles actually have rotating ones that can move, meaning that like if prey gets on and tries to squirm out, these things never come out, even if they like partially get away from the tentacle, and the tentacle like lets go and has to regrip. That's a pretty great design for some sort of horror creature, I have to say. Might be a pain in the butt to model all those, but you could always smile when thinking about the poor person who has to do the textures or rig and animate them, so you know. The tentacles can also be incorporated into design. Notice like how some squid or octopus, for example, like cover it with a huge apron. That's a fun design element that I don't see as often as perhaps would be cool. But they're fantastically useful for gripping things. For example, lots of lab tests have shown that octopus have no problem opening screw-top lids to get at treats inside, or sometimes to place themselves inside. As I will show you here, because there are no bones in them, they're also great at getting into and out of ridiculously tight areas. Here is an octopus that decided that a beer bottle was a great place to hang out in for protection overnight. Now, obviously, if you're going to attach your tentacles to a vertebrate, you cannot do this. You can't stick the vertebrate inside a beer bottle, but if it had to catch something that was trying to hide, if it had a big creature trying to catch small creatures that were trying to hide in nooks and crannies, having tentacles that could squeeze in there could be very cool. Yeah, they do have super impressive camouflage. Notice how this guy's actually walking on the curled up bottoms of his tentacles, not like the tippy toes. Now, that unfortunately only really works for underwater creatures. One thing that tentacles are not good at, or at least not really good at, is moving around on land. Now this guy is not actually trapped. This is a octopus that is intentionally climbing between tide pools, but they have to really kind of like pull themselves along doing it. He's going this way, sorry. But they like pull themselves along and drag some of the other ones. It's not a pretty sight. It might be horrific in the slow chase sense, but it's not going to go very fast. So people who use tentacles and put them on the bottom, like they're not going to walk on them on dry land. That really is not going to work at all. Now, could you conceivably start out with bones at the top and then transition to tentacles? Yeah, maybe you could do that. We'll talk about that in a sec. But so this critter here seems to mostly have tentacles on its legs. Also, it seems to be able to spit up green fluid that's equal to its entire internal volume onto Will Smith. But never mind that. This is probably not a great creature design if it had to do anything, because like it has tentacles it would have to move around on. This is probably not a great creature design. It doesn't have to move on the tentacles. That's good. But it does kind of feel like they come right off this. And the other thing is they're up on the back. And I won't say that can't happen, but I think this is a key point. Animals that have tentacles today inevitably have them around the mouths. Here's the mouth here. That's a nasty beak. Here, let me show you that beak up close. This big, giant parrot-like thing that will happily shred you is what's inside the center of all its tentacles. Tentacles are designed to acquire prey. And so the whole idea is that they're grabbing prey and they're kind of bringing it all in like a bear hug of death once it gets up there to the mouth, which will quickly dispatch you. And while you don't have to put the giant, parrot beak of death in your tentacle designs, I think it is worth thinking that through. If you're going to throw tentacles onto a creature, it's going to be an inherently more plausible design if that's also where it eats. So in that sense, this is kind of good with these tentacles up here because it is around the mouth. The District 9 aliens also kind of good for that reason. The tentacles based around the mouth. I like that quite a lot. Yeah, this is a good point that the symbiont in Spider-Man, it's sort of not really like a typical plausible sort of creature anyways. It kind of has its own rules for how it combines with them. So I agree that the criticism doesn't really apply because it's not really attempting to be a individual design animal. That is a good point. This is actually one of my favorite tentacle creatures. A, the tentacles are again around the mouth, which is a great thing. But B, and really importantly, notice how much the skin around here actually obscures some of the details of the anatomy underneath. And that's a big reason why this is plausible, because it gives you that skin muscle area for these to originate from. So this is the big point about tentacles that I want to tell people. I think you could stick them a lot of places on vertebrates. I particularly like around the mouth, whether it's a mouth on the head or even a displaced mouth somewhere else. But regardless of where they go, what you need to do is actually you need to have the anatomy underneath, but you also need to obscure it with enough maybe slimy, transparent skin to justify where the tentacle muscles are coming from. Because the tentacles can't just be glued to the surface. They can't look like this, in other words. Granted, that's a Halloween, toy, and it's cheap. But this is not a plausible tentacle creature design, because there's no way for these tentacles to support themselves or originate from it and work. One possible solution, if you really have to either have tentacles that can pick people up and hold them up in the air, or if they have to largely just stick to the animal, is you could go the route they did in Independence Day and actually make this some sort of a biosuit with mechanical tentacles with the actual alien as a surprise inside, the chewy nougat center in the exoskeleton. And that's totally okay. If you're doing an alien, that's okay. I actually want to point out another thing I really like about this, both for talking about combining people and mechanical suits or about oversized exoskeletons. You notice these soft, flexible areas they put into the design? They might have gone a little far on those thighs, but I love this. There's the flexible tissue. Here's the more exoskeleton-like structure there. This is a good design. Now, in this case, these were presumably bioengineered by these super intelligent aliens that fly past all the good resources in the solar system just to land on Earth, but never mind that. But the design itself of the exoskeleton suit is quite good, and it's even a pretty good thing if you want to get into designing combinations of people and bionic attachments and stuff too. I think this is a halfway decent starting design concept. So I have a few tentacle do's and don'ts for you. Obviously, adding tentacles is fun. And I do think tentacles, even more than arachnid parts, often add a certain yuck factor to creatures, which, depending on what you're designing it for, can be perfect. Although they can be graceful underwater. If you want, there are lots of things, including squid and octopi, that can look really quite charming and elegant underwater in the right circumstances. And indeed, they could transition from being charming and elegant to being scary, which is actually a great thing to do in a movie, I think, showing an animal side that's worth admiring prior to them, chomping up half of your crew. Tentacles are great for picking up to you or manipulating objects, but they're not so good for walking on, they're not so good for lifting things high up in the air. That is, they're fantastic at contraction, but they're not very good at support. Because tentacles are usually used to acquire prey, in fact that's essentially all they're used for except for locomotion in a few animals, but even then they double as prey acquisition devices, they on Earth at least, are almost always attached to a mouth or mouth-like orifice. They don't emerge like magic from a vertebrate. There has to be, in this case, some sort of a skin-like epidermal or dermal structure that can support it. So if you're going to start adding, tentacles to the back of a horse, or even better, to the horse's mouth, make sure there's a layer of mucousy skin that's over and above the anatomy that already has to be there to make the vertebrate function, to add that necessary realism for it. And if you want to add a skirt to the tentacles or something, that's a great design too, to kind of unite them all together. And if you can't follow these guidelines, and we all know sometime you'll have a director or a script or something that doesn't let you do it regardless of how good your argument is about anatomical plausibility, at least consider making them part of some sort of an exoskeleton or biosuit or something else. I shouldn't say exoskeleton, but exosuit, if you're making intelligent aliens, because it's a great way to solve problems that would otherwise creep up. So these are the main points. I tried to keep them perhaps a little more on target and less expansive than past weeks, since there were a couple of different things. But here's the real take-home points from all of them, since between breathing and exoskeletons and tentacles, we kind of covered a lot of territory. Some real keys that you should just think about in general, and you can always go back to this or go back to your notes, is that breathing and metabolism really matter in creature design. So if you kind of put that thought into it ahead of time, it leads to a more plausible design at the end. Figure out what the creature has to do, what its environment is like, and then you can start to answer questions like how big or small the limb muscles should be. Animals really don't have excess space in them. They're not hollow or whatever. So you really can't just attach things to them as if by super glue. You can't just cut and paste anatomy to them. And you certainly can't make a hard-shelled anatomy just fade into the skin as if it were like a gradient that you can just make disappear at will. With insectoid or arthropod parts, that is, with tentacles, exoskeleton parts, remember to think turtle first and model a transition line that'll have some sort of a hard edge or an end to the exoskeleton, and then the soft or leathery connective tissue from there to the soft body. And the person who said a pincher glove really, I think, had it. That's a great way to think about it, whether it's on the legs, the forearms, or even on the torso. And you can play with that. You could make it a very big transition if the soft vertebrate part has to move a lot in it, or you can make it relatively tight if you're not going to have a lot of movement. So you can make that a design point. And you can definitely also do a series of connected armor parts that then end up being a totally inclusive exoskeleton at some point. With tentacles, make sure you have that transition also, the transition being very different here, because you essentially have to have it lay on top of the other anatomy. You can't lose the other anatomy. You still need, say, your shoulder muscles and your neck muscles, even if you're putting tentacles on the back of the neck. To be there, you have to actually build up on top of that to have your perhaps translucent, icky-looking skin part that can then support the skin muscles that go into the tentacles. And, of course, most of all, I want you to have fun with this, because these are going to be fun designs once you start sticking your exoskeletons and your tentacles onto things. You can go very naturalistic if you want, or if you try to combine them, or you can go very wild and monstery. But the great thing is you can make either one of those plausible as long as you kind of adhere to the design principles of how to stitch them together to make them work functionally. I will definitely take questions now, of course, on anything. And Tom started us out with, is it okay to put stingers at the end of tentacles? That's an interesting question. I have no problem with that idea, but tentacles are not great at pushing hard. So what you're going to have to do, I would think, Tom, is rather than a scorpion one where the tentacle is going to zap to someone and hit it hard, you're instead going to want to make it maybe curl around or pull into them if you can. If it can go past them and go and pull to them, and have the hook of the stinger curve to make that work, to facilitate that. One neat design, if you're animating it, is usually you have to have a contractile muscle that actually injects whatever is in the stinger into them to paralyze or poison them. And since you have a tentacle which is completely soft, you might actually see the end of the tentacle behind the stinger actually do that contracting motion as it was like injecting its prey, which I think would be particularly viscerally intense or horrifying if they were like attacking the hero's love interest or some other victim or something. So that could be actually a really neat design thing as long as it's kind of designed around the shortcomings of tentacles, which is they can't punch very well. Isan, you don't understand how basically, yeah, no, I know what you're getting at. Basically, insect heads are, because they're constructed of exoskeletons, actually have lots of parts that move against each other. Whereas, like with people, the mandible and the maxilla, for example, are bones that are in the skull. The mandible, of course, can move at a hinge way in the back, but you don't see the hinge. And the maxilla, in our case, is largely fused to other bones in our skull. What they're doing is applying similar names to the outer skeletal parts, and those parts can be hinged between them to move the skull. So like you can easily have the upper and lower individual parts moving against the rest of the skull. In an insect, if you've ever, like as a kid, put your hands together at your wrists and made them kind of have teeth and chomp with your ankles or your heels of your palms still attached, that's kind of like what you can do with an insect, both maxilla and mandible, for example, or proboscis or whatever have you, because they can all actually hinge between them. Now, if you're going to overlay them onto a vertebrate skull, you're probably going to more have them as parts that overlay a skull and muscles inside them, so then it would be more like armor. I will look up and try to see if I can find a good diagram, though, to discuss that to post in the forums for you. Add that to my list. Okay. That's a good question, Ian. Tentacles don't actually work like snakes or like sea stars. Snakes, of course, have a vertebral system and muscles. So snakes can strike or punch, if you would, with their heads. Obviously, they tend to bite when they strike, but they can strike out with force because they have those bones and to push against with the muscles. Whereas the tentacles of, say, squid and octopus have muscles but no bones, so they can pull, but they can't push. So like they can work against each other to twist and take a jar, a screwed cap off a jar, but they couldn't like hold the jar and slam it down and break it very well. So they aren't pneumatic. They are muscle-based, but they lack the bone. Yep, they're all skin muscles, exactly. And some of them run longitudinally down the outsides of the tentacles, and then they actually have some other ones, and I forget, I think they go kind of crosswise throughout it. I haven't dissected one in a while. And they also have some tissue in there that isn't muscle, but never mind that for now. Another thing with tentacles, they do, of course, tend to get they can be very thick towards the base, but they almost always start out, whether they're thick or thin, they start out thicker and then thin to some degree as they go out. But not uniformly necessarily. And you might have seen that in like big squid attacks ship or kraken footage, where like you can actually have a pretty thick body of the tentacle until it gets right out towards the tip. But not pipe cleaners, especially again although they can change shape, the area with the suction cups is often flatter if they have suction cups or hooks because it allows them to apply to the surface better. Yeah, I think elephant trunks might be an awesome model if you want to add real tentacles to a mammal like body. Because the trunk is entirely skin muscles also. It's actually even more complicated than the tentacles of a octopus, although of course there's only one, whereas an octopus has 8, which makes up for the lack of complexity. And those are entirely skin muscles. And if you look at an elephant skull, you'll notice how much of what looks like the face from the outside is actually still trunk and muscle going up, and there's no skull there. And I would really recommend thinking about that because, again, that's that transition we talk about, how there has to be a soft tissue base to support the elephant trunk and all those muscles. So there's a whole lot of muscle and skin coming out of the skull, which actually has the nostrils retracted way back up high on the head to come down and support that. Stones. That's an interesting question about whether you can have plants or other like really surrealist parts. I don't have a problem with that. I think in a way the same rules are going to apply where you're going to have to design a transition. Maybe look at plants that can move to some degree, like Venus flytraps, to look at what a hinge looks like on a plant when they do have them. Okay, I'm on to Tom or Fredo's question here about designing humanoid creatures with a mouth opening in a vertical direction. Ah. Okay, so in that case, what you're going to want to do probably is have the rib cage actually end lower. Like you know how on the bottom of a rib cage, like it kind of dips down, like it ends up high in the front, and then it kind of keeps sweeping down on the sides. You're going to want to kind of actually do that in reverse on the front, so that you have room for a jaw-like structure to fit above it. And then you want to run muscles from that still to like the shoulder area and the head area. You might have to really change the skull design as to where the muscles run in the skull, but I'll be able to comment on that better once I see how it integrates with the skull you have. It might lead to a radical change in the humanoid nature of the head shape, too, on the top or the back. But definitely, you're going to want to have the rib cage be modified so that whatever like jaw or skull-like structures are supporting the mouth have room to fit. And you're going to want to run muscles from there back to the sternum and to your shoulders. Yeah, see, worms, if anything, worms are a little bit like not so complicated tentacles for squid. But because they're not so complicated, they tend to have even less design applications. And worms mostly only work when they're small and they're not supporting a lot of weight, or not trying to squeeze a lot of weight, because of the simple muscle systems in a very thin skin area. So like the whole thing can't take much pressure. And as a result, I kind of left worms out because there's nothing a worm can do that a like octopus tentacle can't do significantly better, and would therefore probably be better applied to like trying to combine with a vertebrate or something. But yes, worms are very much like simplified and weaker living tentacles of a squid. That's certainly a fair analogy, just not perhaps as useful for combining with other anatomies. All right, do we have anything else? Into the Mars mission? I was also excited about Curiosity. If any, I think one or two of you have joined me on social media. You probably saw me posting all about that. Yeah, I don't think they're going to find any of these creatures we designed. From a realistic, hardcore science point of view, there is almost undoubtedly water in the past on Mars, and there's almost certainly water frozen on Mars now. The evidence is pretty overwhelming, and some of it may melt at least occasionally, or deep down it could be melted. I don't think we're going to find even bacterial-like life alive, because if it's there, it's going to have to probably be deep underground where Curiosity could not get to it. Some sort of a thermal area with melted water. And they'd have to be like lithotrophs, animals that basically get their energy by eating rocks that they break down. But if there are fossils of those kinds of like simple bacteria or algae-like creatures or analogs there, And if they used to be common enough in the past that they could like be found as fossils on the surface of Mars, I think Curiosity has at least a chance in hell of finding them. Since I have no idea how common those things once were and what the ages are of the rocks that are exposed where it landed, I really don't have a feeling at all for how likely it is, even if such things are there, which we don't know. However, I suspect it's probably likely that at one point there was some sort of simple bacteria or bacteria-like life there. If for no other reason than we've already shown that bacteria can survive being knocked off of they can survive getting knocked off of our planets when big enough rocks hit our planets, and they can also survive being reintroduced into our planets, like when things are dropped from, say, the space station that have bacteria on them and they re-enter its atmosphere. Some satellites, we found this. Things that were on there survived the trip back in. And if those two things are true, there's really no reason why, even if life only originated on Earth and nowhere else in the entire universe, why in the last several billion years a few rocks with life didn't still get knocked off and find their way to Mars when there was water long ago. So it seems like the odds are good that there could have been at least some very incredibly simple single-celled life at Mars at one time. Not only could we, honestly, we almost couldn't avoid starting Prometheus from Mars and probably every other frozen moon in the solar system, Remy, to be totally honest. The question is whether they would be able to adapt and survive when they got there, which honestly I don't know the answer to. I mean, that's going to be the difference between it, and maybe assumptions about just how often Earth was hit after life was here and how often that translates into, most rocks are lost, obviously. It's like the solar system is mostly filled with empty space by a really wide margin, but a few of them do get trapped in gravity wells. We know that. We found rocks from, say, Mars on Earth that we know came from Mars, so it certainly works in reverse. But yeah, whether it led to anything like in Prometheus is obviously a whole different issue. Okay, recommend resources. Well, if I can selfishly plug my own website, it should be due for some pretty massive overhauls of materials going on there in coming weeks and months. I actually have an overhaul to move it to a proper CMS that's essentially 95% done. I just have to have the time to do it, which I haven't had because of a wonderful project like this in the last 6 months or so. And because I'm now more aware of the kinds of useful things in terms of, like, say, comparative anatomy between dinosaurs and mammals or other things, there's going to be a lot more of that type of stuff. My blog obviously more often covers stuff related to dinosaurs, but it is at least general anatomy. And several of the blogs I link to on there cover some pretty good anatomy stuff. I imagine, of course, that there's going to be lots more great classes coming through Visualarium, as yet another selfish plug for the Visualarium guys. So obviously, you should always watch that space, but I'm sure most of you already do, since many of you have been here before. I don't know of a whole lot of books that cover this well enough that I would want to recommend them, to be honest. I hope someday to rectify that, but I don't want to be like, hey, wait for my book, because I have no idea when that will happen. Quite possibly not anytime soon. But it is something that needs to be done. It's clearly there's a need out there that isn't being filled. But yeah, let's see. Mike Habib, H-A-B-I-B. I think I linked to one or both of his blogs from my blog, which you can get to from my site. He does anatomy and often flying creatures really well. There's also a pretty cool site on pterosaurs, not called the Pterosaur Heresies, with John Conway and a few others on there. And John and Mark and the other bloggers there do a fantastic job covering pterosaur anatomy and even more about flight. It's dinosaur specific. There's another one called something about functional paleontology, maybe, by Heinrich Mallison, and he a lot of the stuff he posts is more generic, like he'll have like a mammal of the week or whatever, but he does do occasionally great posts on like using 3D scan technology and how to reconstruct dinosaurs, and there's a lot of just general anatomy in there that would apply when you're designing creatures from like the inside out. So if you like go through and find those specific posts when they come up every few weeks, that's probably a pretty neat site, and you can't get that kind of stuff easily anywhere else. As far as muscle reconstructions, I need to post more of mine. I don't honestly know of many sites that do it. Yeah, it's just one of those things that isn't covered as well as it ought to be. There are a few technical papers that are available as PDFs. If any of you want to email me, I could probably send them your way that at least show some neck and leg muscles and back muscles for dinosaurs. Yeah, I've seen some of those episodes, Lee, and I don't know if I've seen them on the Southern Casper or not, but those are good shows. I would definitely recommend taking a look at that. There are some jaw muscle diagrams in the original handy dandy skeletal guide that's both on my website and should be, I think, somewhere with the forum materials from the first week, Isan. So you could look there. I do agree though that like clarifying even more how those muscles work is something I should look at for future posts. Believe me, when it comes to blog topics, discussing this with you guys have certainly broadened made me aware of more issues that should be talked about that are not. You know, paleontologists often like beers, but I've seen it split kind of evenly between dark beers, like microbrew dark beers, and microbrew lagers. But usually, any kind of decent local beer will win you friends real fast with paleontologists. Geologists too, although you probably don't need to talk to rock jocks quite as much in this line of work. Yeah, unfortunately I can't post like public PDFs because they're not my papers and they belong in journals. And in theory, unless they're like made free access, I can't just like put them up publicly and be like, come and get them. But if you guys contact me, I could probably share some of them for academic and educational use. That would be fine. And also, obviously, you'll be working, I hope, in the forums, and I'll be active there with you. Yeah, good ways to get a hold of me. So I use Google Plus and Facebook. I prefer Google Plus. I end up using Facebook a lot because of sheer volume. Everyone's on Facebook. It's certainly a lot easier to share specific things on Google Plus, and the general tenor of conversation feels like it's a higher grade of pudding on average. But you can get a hold of me in either one of those. And then you can also, if you guys want, you could friend me on the forums, of course, which some of you have. And you can also get a hold of me through Gmail chat, which is the only one I really use, and that's skeletal drawing, as if it were all one word, as is my email, skeletaldrawing@gmail.com. So feel free. As far as schools that offer paleontology, you know, if you're looking about an undergraduate degree, Isan, there really aren't almost any. There are a couple. I believe the South Dakota School of Mines does, and I think there's one or two other ones. But by and large, as an undergraduate degree, really you end up getting a degree in either zoology or biology with an emphasis, obviously, in functional morphology and evolution, or else you get a degree in geology with an emphasis on like stratigraphy and fossils. And it's usually not until graduate school that people get to specialize really in paleontology. And that's mostly because it's just not the biggest, most prevalent field in terms of cranking out job. An undergraduate with a paleo degree is not going to like fall into a job somewhere the way they would if they have like a degree in geology that perhaps helps set them up to work in like for an oil company, or if they work in a biology degree and they could go work for like a biotech company right away. However, if you are looking for graduate school, if you're looking for a graduate school, there are actually at least a dozen or 2 dozen pretty darn good schools I could recommend. But mostly what you'd want to do by then is you'd actually want to go to like a paleo meeting and meet with potential graduate advisors. It's still a small enough field that it's all first person. And what you really want to do is meet someone you actually want to work with and make sure they feel like they want to work with you, and perhaps that they're working on a subject you're really interested in. That tends to work better than worrying just about the school per se. So, all right, if there are no other questions, it's time for Ryan and some ZBrush goodness. But I want to thank you guys. It's been a really great time. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys continue to model this week. And you've just asked some fantastic questions, and you know, nothing makes a class better than having great questions be asked. So thank you guys.